All right. Well, welcome everybody. Let's start by reading our text together, and then we'll start with whatever questions you have. And my question to you always is, what is this about? All right. So we're reading from Mark chapter 9, starting with verse 30. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He, meaning Jesus, we assume, did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed in human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. When they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent. For on the way, they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them. And taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." And that's as far as we're going to read today. All right. So, what questions, comments, interests do you have regarding this text that we need to be sure to talk about before we're done here today?
Why he didn't want anyone to know?
I beg your pardon?
Why he didn't want anyone
Yeah,
to know?
let's hold that question and wonder about it a little bit. June?
I may have been way off, and I have since kind of changed my mind. But when I first was reading this, first couple times, and not today, but before, when they were arguing who is greatest, I thought they were arguing the Messiah or God. That they had the Messiah right here, and isn't he the greatest? And that they were arguing that way. And now, and I kept thinking as I was studying this, is why did they think they were talking about themselves? But now I think they were probably talking about who was greatest among the two.
Yeah, well, again, that's another question we just have to hold. It's not answered particularly clearly in this story. So I think at best, we can only come up with possibilities and then kind of weigh which one we think kind of holds the most water. That's great. Any other? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm kind of intrigued with just the last part about the child. It's easy to feel kind of mushy about that, and,
Right.
But taking a step back, it's odd, I think. I'd like to maybe see if there's more to it.
Yeah, it is a little odd. You're right. It's kind of heartwarming, and Jesus loves the little children, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm guessing the impact may have been something like if Jesus had been on a southern plantation and took one of the slaves' children and held that child and said, "Anybody who receives such a child is this welcomes not just me, but also God." I just feel like children were so marginalized for the most part, and they weren't always considered as having any inherent worth unless they were an heir, and then they had inherited worth. But I'm sort of guessing. I don't know what the day-to-day feeling about. I imagine everyone's found children to be cute, but
so the child is representing the marginalized.
It seems to me that that's a pretty good way to take it. I don't know for sure, and again, just not being a first century Palestinian resident, I wouldn't know how people interpreted that moment. It's kind of interesting that the three verbs that are used there, Jesus takes the child, So the first verb is a very common one for taking whatever. You see it all the time. And the second is he centered the child on them. He set the child on them. That's the verb istemi, which means to set something down, or even to sit down. So it's also very common. But the third verb, which I translate as embrace. But I think in our scripture, it says taking in his arms, but it's a different word than the first time it's translated. He took a child. It's not the same verb. This is a verb that shows up 2 times in the scripture, in the New Testament. And the second use of it is also in Mark, when they bring children to Jesus. And the disciples try to shoo them away. And Jesus takes them, says, for such is the kingdom of God. So it appears twice, both times with reference to children. And it means to take into one's arms, which is why I translated it as embrace rather than just take, because it's different from the common word for take, not even close to it. That's interesting. And whatever the first century vision of children was, Jesus is being very deliberate to treat this child with tremendous respect. Yes, ma'am.
Well, it seems to me too, Bill, that he's using what's available, that's recognizable, that's tangible, because this is the second time now he's trying to give a lesson to the disciples about who he is and what's happening. And he took things that were present in their life, like this demon-possessed girl or the weak, sick girl. Sickness was all around. And then he took a child all around. And I think it's interesting because it's always something that they weren't expecting. That the disciples were not expecting that he would embrace a child to use as his lesson.
Right. So there's an interesting thread in the scriptures that may not be easy to pick up on as you read story after story after story. But when you step back and you kind of see all the stories in succession, and it's the preference of the younger over the older. So it happened in the Old Testament. Abraham has 2 sons. The first is Ishmael. The second, Isaac, is the one in this story who is the promised son, through whom God will fulfill the promise to Abraham. Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the younger. They're twins, but Esau comes out first. Jacob comes out hanging on to his foot. So Isaac has 2 sons. The younger is preferred over the older. And it's even said explicitly, I've chosen the younger over the older. It's even put into terms that I think probably don't need to have the impact that they have when they're translated to English. But Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Some scholars say that really should be loved less rather than hated. Like God didn't seem to have anything against Esau just because he came up first. And then Jacob had 12 sons, and it was his 11th son, Joseph, who becomes elevated as, second to the Pharaoh in the entire kingdom of Egypt. And Benjamin, the final son, was the beloved son for Jacob after he thought Joseph was dead. So you have over and over again this kind of process of inversion, because the cultural time was that the elder gets half the inheritance and the rest of the sons divvy it up. So basically the oldest child for Jacob should have gotten half of his inheritance, and the other 11 were sent to fight it out. And so that inversion, that's no small thing in a culture that prefers the elder. That theme throughout Genesis, anyway, will pop up again in the story of David, right? He's a ruddy little runt kid of the litter that when Samuel comes to Jesse, his father, saying one of your sons is to be the king of Israel, Jesse brings out all of his sons except for David and parades them in front of Samuel, and God's whispering in Samuel's ear, no, that's not, no, that's not, no, that's not. And finally, Samuel asks Jesse, do you have any other sons? He said, oh, yeah, I mean, there's David out there keeping sheep, but he's just a kid. He says, bring him in. And when he brings him in, God says, that's the one. So it's that same law of inversion that's happening in the call of David. David supplants Saul, who was the first king, and becomes the better king, and so forth. So you have that, and it's not just about sons, but in some respects, it's also Israel trying to make a case that, yeah, look, we're the little kid next to Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, all these great kingdoms, but it's not unusual that God would be our God and that we would have a promise and a covenant with God, because that's how God rolls. Listen to this story, and there you go. And then, when we get to the New Testament, we see that continuing through these paradoxes that Jesus gives. The first shall be last. Whoever would be great among you must be servant. So you take the cultural presumption about hierarchy and you flip it upside down. It was also in the book of Acts. There's this moment in chapter 4 or 5, 4, I think. A couple of the apostles are brought before the council they've been teaching and they healed somebody, and they're gathering crowds and getting a lot of notice. And they get brought before the Jewish council. And it says they look down at them as ignorant and unlearned men, because they're fisher folk. They're not biblical scholars, probably can't read well, if, maybe functionally illiterate, more or less. And yet here they are interpreting scripture and preaching and teaching, and people are listening and being captivated by it. And so you got these, elders who are wise and trained and smart, suddenly feeling what it's like for God to choose Jacob over Esau and to subvert cultural expectation. So my suggestion is that this moment of taking and centering a child as being the representative of what it's like to welcome God and Christ and so forth, is within that flow. That yes, this is how God works. And so don't be surprised if God should choose the weak and beggarly elements, as the Apostle Paul calls the church, to profound the wise, because that's how God works. So I think about that the next time Pentecostal Presbyterians look down their nose at Pentecostal, right? It's like, hey, you know what?
That's right.
They may be all that, and you may have good reason to feel the way you feel about them, but don't doubt that God can be using them nonetheless, right? That's it.
Amen.
Believe me. Okay, so maybe that's the whole point with the child is God subverting this kind of cultural sense of hierarchy. Who is valued? Who could possibly be a speaker, a representative for God? And Jesus makes the child. Yes, sure.
Well, we do remember the very famous story where everybody's gathered, and he's preaching and the children rush up and the disciples try to push the children away. I mean, he made it very plain then that as far as he was concerned, they were as important.
Right, and that story is going to follow this one, but that's the second use of this word for embrace. That's the second time we hear it, and it's right there with children. Yeah. Okay, any other initial questions, comments you want to make sure we chat about? we're kind of all over the text, okay, but that's okay.
No question, but it, I like the idea that they are obviously in a setting where there are a lot more people around and obviously a family. This is not just, they've stopped someplace, Jesus and the 12.
Right,
But clearly
right,
they're in
and-
a house, there's a child,
right,
and he gathers the 12, meaning there are lots of other folks there.
Right.
But he gathers the 12, so we've got a setting that is a lot more fluid than I remember reading about.
yeah, and same here, really. I think this time through is when I started paying attention. Oh, wow. So they've been on this journey, right? And it seems to be Jesus and the 12, and then there are always crowds, but they kind of come and go, right? And then it's Jesus and the 12, crowds go, Jesus and the 12. So we have this sense, we know Simon Peter is married. One presumes that he has children, but given the culture of the time, they don't mention them. Somebody, I read it years ago that there was a biography of, I think, a famous Roman general. And it went through his whole life and everything about it, never once mentioned his spouse or his children. So the whole biography. But from that perspective, it was more important the battles that he won than the fact that he had a couple pups at home, And with the disciple, I mean, we're tasting that a little bit. We don't know whose child this is. It remains anonymous. But you're right. That tells us, yes, there are times that it's Jesus and the 12 surrounded by a crowd, Jesus and the 12 on the side of the road by themselves, Jesus and James and John and Peter up on the mountain, coming down to a big crowd. But they are home. Capernaum is home. And that's why I think in the video, either I did or I intended to tell you to imagine that they're decamping, they're washing their clothes. They're revictualling their supplies, getting ready to go down to Judea. They're reuniting with their family. They're preparing their family for another trip. It may be that some of these spouses and children were with them on the journey, and they're, visiting grandma and grandpa before they take. I don't know. It sure seems that after the death and resurrection of Jesus in Jerusalem, that most of the apostles ended up inhabiting there. And one would imagine that their families became part of that. But, again, none of the biblical writers embraces the kind of family approach to storytelling that we take for granted today. So we just don't hear about it. Well, no, we know whose father and brother people are. But
That's
I'm
what
sorry.
I found it. They traveling and no families, like you say, they don't speak of anything.
Right.
And they're so far away from their families, evidently.
Yeah.
And another thing is, they constantly are arguing. Don't you
That's
think
because their
Jesus
families are
goes-
there.
That's probably why. But don't you think Jesus gets, oh boy, here they go again.
Yeah.
It's constant. I did wonder what happens with their families when they're on the road so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, and we just don't know. All we can do is speculate. But I do want to say, when you're reading the Gospel of Mark, you will come away with a not very high opinion of the disciples. It's a little different in Matthew. It's considerably different in Luke, when you see Luke as volume 1 and the book of Acts as volume 2. Because after Pentecost, they really step up and they become very, very different than the ignorant dolts that they appear to be in some of these stories. For example, last week in Mark's Gospel, we read how Jesus says he's going to Jerusalem. Simon Peter takes him aside and rebukes him, and then get behind me, say, look at how Matthew tells that story. Very, very differently. When Peter When Peter in the Gospel of Matthew says, "You are the Christ," Jesus says, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar Jonah, son of Jonas." We don't know his mother. They're not mentioning the women here. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So that was a divinely inspired thing when Peter said, "You are the Christ," in Matthew's gospel. In Mark's gospel, as soon as Peter says it, Jesus rebuked them and told them to say nothing. Very, very different. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Peter will turn around and take his foot and stick it directly in his mouth. And he will end up being rebuked and "Get behind me, Satan." That happens in Matthew too. That's just the second half of the story. In the first half, Peter's answer seems to be right. So Matthew and Mark have very theologically different perspectives on what happened in that first instance when Jesus said he was going to Jerusalem. And Peter answered the question, "Who do you say that I am?" by saying, "You are the Christ." Very different perspectives. And just be aware of that. In Mark's gospel, I've said this many times, and I need you to know this is kind of, I think, a worthwhile working hypothesis. Werner Kelper argues that in Mark's view, the disciples fail. They fail. And he says that because of the 16th chapter. That after the resurrection, the women go to the tomb, they see what we think is an angel who says, "Go tell Peter and his disciples that he will meet you in Galilee, as he said." And the 8th verse reads, "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." And that's the original ending of Mark's gospel. Verses 9 through 21 were added and seem to have been added later, considerably later. It ends that way. And if you read the book of Acts, and if it's a reliable history for us, they did not go to Galilee like he told them. They stayed in Jerusalem. And they established the Christian movement they were part of in Jerusalem, where in Mark's gospel, they were supposed to do it in Galilee, among the villages. Kind of a small, diversified grassroots movement in these small villages, not doing like empires do, which is gravitate toward the big city and establish a hierarchical system. It's a really different view. And I think in Mark's gospel, that's what the apostles should have done. And that's what Mark is encouraging the church to do, apart from the apostles, is to do this small grassroots faith movement that the reign of God is here. So I think that's where Mark, I think that's why Mark is not going to give the disciples a break here. This is the second of 2 disclosures, and they don't do well in response. And they won't the third time either. But you all do that. Yes, ma'am.
But if you think about when this is written.
Yep.
He has to be aware, doesn't he, that they pull through eventually.
Well, or he's answering the theological question of that time. The theological question. If Jerusalem is the city of God, the city of David, what do we do now?
It's been destroyed.
It's just been destroyed.
Right, yeah, right. Back to the village.
That's a theological problem.
Yeah.
It was the same thing had happened hundreds of years before, when the 3 signs of God's promise to the people of Israel were a king, like David, the temple, and the land. The king was blinded after his family was killed in front of him and deposed and replaced by the Babylonians. The first temple was destroyed and or at least vacated, unusable. And the land was made up of remnants who were either too old, too young, or too worthless to be taken away into slavery in the exile. You have three great signs of God's promise. So the theological question that comes out of that is, has God abandoned the promise? Has God left us? And that's the question that the prophets are trying to answer, prophets of that era, saying, no, you abandoned God. You made all these unholy alliances. Your king was no better than anybody else's king. You acted like other countries. You weren't supposed to do that. They even go back and tell the story. You know why you have a king? You wanted to be like all of your neighbors. God told you you don't need a king. You had a judge, Samuel, and that's how God wanted it to be. But you insisted on a king. And Samuel told you, if you get a king, you're going to end up with a king. And kings do king things, which means they're going to draft your kids and they're going to take your daughters and they're going to take your land and they're going to lead you into battle and you're going to have to fight while they stay in the palace. And sure enough, that's what happened. So there's so much happening around the time of the exile because people were dealing with this theological struggle. We thought that God was on our side, and these were the three great signs. And when those three great signs are taken away, the real spiritual theological question, and it's huge, is, were we wrong? Is there a God? If there is a God, is this God for us or against us? That's what the prophets are trying to answer. And I would suggest that in the year 70, a very similar set of theological conundrum questions have to arise. They have to arise. The temple has been destroyed. The 13th chapter of Mark, which is often called Mark's little apocalypse, right? Because that's where Mark says that everything bad is going to happen. This is 13th chapter of Mark. It's awful reading. It starts with Jesus and the disciples sitting over and against the temple, and the disciples, at least one of them, is admiring the temple. Wow, look at that. And it was considered not only beautiful, but impenetrable. I mean, it would never be defeated. And Jesus begins by saying, you see this building? There will come a day when not one stone will be left on top of another. Mm-hmm. That's the theological problem they have to deal with, is when you think that God is on your side and you are on God's side because of the sacrifices that happened through this temple, because of the whole system of faith that emanates out of this temple, because you've been taught all of your life that God's presence is most profoundly bound in the Holy of Holies in that temple and kind of emanates out from there. That's why the temple complex itself is holy. That's why part of the temple you can't have Gentile. They have to be over here in a little bit of the less holy section. And the whole city of Jerusalem is the holy city of Jerusalem, and the land is the holy land. When you grow up with that kind of thinking, and suddenly this temple is destroyed, you've got a real theological problem. And either you weren't paying attention, didn't believe it in the first place, or you were paying attention. And now your faith is in shambles. And that's who Mark is writing to. I mean, that's the kind of dilemma to which Mark is writing. And Mark's argument, it'll be different from Matthew and Luke, and especially for John. But in Mark's argument, that was not the right premise in the first place. The reign of God is at hand. Jesus said that in Galilee. That's where we're supposed to live into it. So anyway, what did you say that got me started on that? I'm sorry. Anyway, I think we are answering a real theological life Okay. Any other questions? We're still on these preliminary questions here. Okay, first of all, I realized as soon as I stopped the tape that I had misspoken about something, and that's the kind of thing that you might not have even caught it, and it's going to keep you awake. I kind of represented that the next story after this one is in chapter 10, and I didn't mean to. I understand chapter 9 goes on. There are a few more things around it. What I should have said is the next location that's given is at the beginning of chapter 10. So remember, this story says from there, they went through Galilee, and then they went to Capernaum. So what we were told is back in chapter 8, they were in the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And then at the beginning of chapter 9, verse 2, which should be the first verse in chapter 9, if the people who gave us versification had split this up correctly. In verse 2, Jesus and 3 of the disciples go up on a high mountain. And then in verse 9, they come down from that mountain, and that's when they re-engage with the other disciples, and there's a big crowd because the other disciples are trying to cast out a demon. Can't do it. So we were in Galilee. We went up a mountain, which is somewhere, we don't know where, down the mountain. Now they're going through Galilee and into Capernaum. And and the next time any location is given to us is in the first verse of chapter 10, and they enter into Judea. So that's making their way south toward Jerusalem. Okay. I misstated that somewhere along the line in the video. So let's go back to the question that they're going through Galilee, heading toward Capernaum, and he did not want anyone to know it. What do we think the point of that is? It's the last half of verse 30.
What is the it?
Well, one would think the antecedent to that pronoun is passing through Galilee. There's nothing else that presents itself to me as.
So he did not want them to know that he did not want the crowds to know he was transiting.
Maybe that's it. Yeah. I mean, he's always on the move, more or less, but maybe he doesn't realize.
Hard to move from
we're out of here
on foot and not have people.
Well, they don't know where you're going. You could be crossing the street, and he's crossing the street and turn around, or you could be heading to the next town, in which case they might say, "Where are you going?" Right? So I don't know. I don't know. But the reason seems to be implied in the very next verse, because it begins with the word for. Remember, anytime you see the for, you ask, what is this there for? And it says, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, and then we get the next disclosure. I don't call it a prediction, but a disclosure that he's going to be betrayed and killed, and on the third day rise again. So I don't have a really good explanation for what the whole he didn't want anyone to know it is about. If he's teaching the disciples that he's going to die, and he doesn't want people to hear that broadly, then that's weird, because last week, when he just said he was going to die, it's followed by the statement, he said all of this quite openly. But it doesn't seem that Jesus is trying to be cryptic about it. One possibility is that given the way the disciples responded the first time, maybe Jesus is kind of thinking, well, this is going to take a while. This needs some interpretation, and maybe he's not so public about it the second time around. I don't know. And maybe he is in fact heading toward Jerusalem at this point, and that's a little different than just saying one of these days I'm gonna do this. Is that in fact be doing? I mean, we're still pretty deep into Galilean territory when you're in Capernaum. It's on the Sea of Galilee. So I don't know. I don't know exactly what Mark is implying with that.
It seems to me he's maybe controlling when he is going to be confronted with his enemy.
Yeah,
I don't know, but I mean,
Yeah.
you know, he wants it to happen supposedly in a certain place.
yeah, it could be because almost all the gospel stories, they're a little different, but they're pretty close in this. Is the Last Supper is part of the Passover celebration. So it's not unusual for Galileans to go down to Jerusalem for a high holy day like that. So that wouldn't be terribly unusual. It does seem that Jesus has a deliberate calendar of events in mind where he's going to have that Last Supper and celebrate Passover with the disciples. John's gospel has it like a day later, on the last day of Passover when the lamb is killed. And that's partly because of John's theology being a little bit different about Jesus being the sacrificial lamb. But yeah, it seems like, I think you might be right, Shirley, just that Jesus is being very deliberate, kind of getting things, Jesus is quite the organizer in many ways, and getting things ready to head down there, to be there on the week that he's there. And so that he can celebrate the Passover. He didn't call it the Passover with his disciples. Okay, I gave you on the back of your handout a side-by-side comparison of the first and the last disclosure, or and the second disclosure. The stuff in yellow, I thought were essentially the same thing. It is a little different. In the first disclosure, he mentions suffering and rejection. In the second, he talked about betrayal. And when you hear the word betrayed, right, you're thinking Judas as part of this story. In the first one, he mentions the elders, the chief priests, and the scribe. And it would seem that for that to happen, to be put to death by those three groups, that you need to be in Jerusalem. There may have been elders elsewhere and chief priests, scribes, but acting in concert like that, it would seem like that the implication is we're heading to Jerusalem. But in neither of these did Jesus mention Jerusalem. Okay, that will come later. In the second disclosure, Jesus is betrayed and betrayed into human hands. Now you can widen the story a little bit. We can bring in Pilate, not just the council that Jesus has brought, but Pilate, the Roman soldiers who actually carry out the execution with their hands. So it's interesting, Jesus doesn't just say the same thing over and over again, but he describes the same thing a little differently each time. What do you make of that? Do you think the difference is? What do you make of the difference?
I think it's a little more detailed, and I think the disciples are not asking the right questions all along. If they stop and thought and listen, then they might ask, who is going to betray us? Who are the human hands? I mean, they might have a general idea because they knew the Romans were against them. And there's all of that, but they just weren't. They weren't focused. I didn't feel.
Yeah, because that whole betray part. Just think about the Last Supper. Because it's there that Jesus looks at them, says, "One of you will betray me." Then they start asking.
Then they,
And they ask in the form that it's not me, is it? not me, is it? Surely it's not me, is it? They deny it, but they not with a lot of certainty. I would never do that, would I? You know, that kind of thing.
And see, they didn't start asking that when you first mentioned it.
They didn't. I think they're assuming someone else is betraying. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, they have a lot of coming down from their high horses to do before they can really grasp that they're actually implicated here, I think.
I think sometimes they're afraid just to ask.
Yeah, isn't that just the weirdest part of this whole thing?
Yes.
Now, I attached verse 32 to verses 33 and following. The Bible that I have in front of me right now makes it part of the paragraph before. So when Jesus gives the disclosure in verse 31, it's immediately followed by this. But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask. The first part doesn't surprise us. It's not the first time they didn't understand. But now they're afraid. What does that do? Boy, that statement doesn't allow me to have the kind of romantic view I had of Jesus and the 12 before this, that they were all buzzed and, you know, gathered again, and they were all just convinced that Jesus is the one and knew their place or anything like that. They were afraid to ask what this means. They were afraid. That's not good.
I thought that was kind of the aha of this whole thing and how it applied it to my life, how often I am afraid to ask the hard questions.
Yeah.
You don't really want to know.
You don't really know. what-
Well, that's the thing. You just like maybe it's not a healthy, but at least not a stupid fear.
And he had spoken out against to Peter the last time. So they didn't want the same thing to happen.
Right. Yeah. And so the idea I had that maybe the reason Jesus was not wanting anyone to know because he was teaching the disciples is maybe Jesus figured out right after the first time that this is real hard information. But certainly we can say the disciples figured out the last thing you want to do is tell Jesus, don't do that. We're not going to rebuke Jesus this time around. We don't know what we're going to think. We don't know what to think. We don't understand it. But we're sure as heck not going to stand up and say anything. Because last time you saw it happen to Peter. Simon Peter seems to have gotten, he can be taught. He does not speak up and rebuke Jesus this time. That's the opposite of rebuking, is say nothing because they're scared. But even so, the pattern continues. Jesus gives a disclosure, the disciples respond wrongly. And so as they travel, they come to Capernaum, and when they're in the house, Jesus says, all right, what were you arguing about? It doesn't have to be arguing. The Greek term there is transliterated into English as dialogue. So dia means across, and lego is a very common word for talking. So it could be dialogue, it could be arguing too. It's translated that way often. It depends on the context. Could be just discussing. I think that's probably as neutral as we can make it. What were you discussing on the way? And and here it is. They were silent because on the way they had argued with one another. And this is where I want you to look at your handout for a minute, okay? So under Roman numeral 2, letter C, I have 2 Greek words there. The first looks like a TIS photo. You see that? See that word? Okay. Those are the Greek letters for T, I, and S. Well done. S is a weird Greek letter because if it's in the middle of the word, it's written one way. If it's at the end of the word, it's written another way. And a final ending S looks kind of like our F. So that's the word teeth. Teeth. It's an interrogative pronoun. It's either translated what or who. What or who. Can go either way. There's no verb. There's no verb here. They were arguing about teeth, maison. There's no verb. Teeth is an interrogative pronoun. Maison is an adjective. It's a comparative kind of superlative adjective based on the Greek word mega. Mega, which in Greek, just like in English, means great. A megastar is a superstar, big star, great star. Mega is a word for loud, for large, for great, for many. It's a very common Greek term, and this is an interesting form of it. It's a comparative form of it. So my suggestion is that it could be translated a couple of different ways. And I'm going to tell you that on Saturday and Sunday in my sermon, I'm going to go with the least popular translation and just hold that question for a bit. The most popular translation is what they were discussing, arguing, dialoguing on the way is who is the greatest. And we have to supply a verb because in English you can't have a phrase without a verb, without being called Southern. So usually the verb to be gets supplied there. They were discussing who is the greatest. And some folks kind of take it a little farther and say who among them is the greatest. In our translation, they put it in the past tense. They had argued with one another who was the greatest. The word was is supply. There's no verb in the Greek. Typically, when you supply a verb, the best thing to do is just go with the verb to be, and then you're making less of a leap in judgment. It could be what is greatness? What is great? What constitutes great? Well, and it would make sense if you've left your nets to follow Jesus, who's told you twice now that he's gonna die and be raised, but I don't know if you have a frame of reference of what that means exactly. You've thrown your lot in with this one. You've declared this one the Messiah, right? That's what they thought. And yet you hear that he's gonna die. And so now I think it's a good question. What is great? Or so that's what we're going to look at on Sunday. I'll save all my juice for that. The other way the question could be framed is who is greatest? And that's a good possibility based on the third disclosure. Because when Jesus tells him the third time that he's going to die, immediately James and John come to him and ask to be seated when he comes in his kingdom on his right and on his left. They want front seat, more or less, in the Jesus car. And so there seems to be among the suggestion, if it's translated, who is the greatest? And that's what they were arguing about on the way. It could be they're trying to figure out where they fit in the hierarchy. Jesus is the Christ, and every good emperor is going to have generals, right? And then those generals will have lieutenant generals, and then they'll have, the captains, and then they'll have, and hierarchical thinking is some people's only way to imagine a reign of God being possible. And here we are, we're the 12, we're the insider. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a mountain. They got pretty good arguments there. Yeah, well, hello, Bartholomew. But once you get named as part of the 12, you never get named again. I went up the mountain with Jesus. I saw him in all his glory. So obviously, we're going to be the tri-captains underneath Jesus. And, you can imagine all the different ways this goes. That seems to be, that's a really good possibility is what they're arguing about is who among them was the greatest. That's one possibility. Yes.
Well, isn't it kind of verified too by the next verse?
Well, yeah,
Who wants
yes.
that, I mean, that it lends some credence to that.
Right. So the question, whoever would be great, do this, right? So that may not be. It may not be that they're arguing that among themselves who is the greatest. They might be questioning what does greatness look like.
That could
Jesus,
Yeah.
John the Baptist died, but he had paved the way for Jesus. Now you got Jesus. Is he gonna die, pave the way for something else? But is that what great leaders do? What are we looking for? What are we longing for when we long for Messiah? Someone to rescue us, someone to lead us, someone to whom we can give our loyalty. And how do we become great? Not necessarily because we want to, I think that's a good way to ask that question. How do we become great? Now, we're Presbyterians, and we've been taught from the cradle that you don't ask that question. You're getting too big for your britches. You're supposed to be humble, and for your whole life, no matter how great you are, you're supposed to say, "Oh, I'm not." You sang really, really well. Oh, my throat is just so dry. Your dress is lovely. Oh, this whole thing. You did a good job leading this group. Oh, it didn't really go the way we wanted it to, but thanks be to God, things work out, right? We've been taught all of our lives that you can't get upbeat, right, and aspire to greatness. But that's not how most people have been taught. If you read Aristotle, I mean, it's all about what constitutes greatness. How do you live into your potential to its highest? That's the mark of successful life. If you live into who you're called to be, your potential. You don't want to leave the cards on the table without giving it your all. So I want us to hear the question of being great, not as a braggadocious sort of, thinking more of yourself than you ought sort of thing, as much as what does it mean to live our lives to its fullness? That's one way of thinking about being great. And the way you live your life to your fullness is you take a child that hasn't lived into any fullness. It's just nothing but potential. And it may be a failure, and it may not be. And you welcome this child in the name of Christ. And by doing that, by turning your attention to that one who is not great, cute maybe, but not great, you are exhibiting greatness. That's paradox. That's paradox, right? Whoever will be first must be last. But that's why I want to take it just out of the context of the disciples squabbling with each other over which one of them is Jesus' top guy, and put it into more of the right kind of questions we ought to be asking. Because when Jesus says, "Whoever would be great among you," he doesn't seem to be saying that disparaging. That in itself is not a bad aspiration. You want to live your life to the fullest. do it by serving. That turns your world upside down. Does that make sense? That's why I just want to push back on, this is more than just these 12 people trying to get the front seat. That's going to happen in the next story, the next disclosure. We'll deal with that when we deal with it. But this is not, and this may be a question that has been echoed by men throughout history. And I think it's harder for men to hear. Because I think women, by socialized disposition, perhaps, I don't know why, but I do think that within the role that women have had in almost all the societies we know, this is really obvious. They would be like, that's right, you. Good on you. Your mama taught you well. I don't think they would see this as radically different at all. But I think men who have always looked up to, men have often argued either LeBron James or Michael Jordan is the greatest. And they aspire to be the GOAT, right? This is kind of a guy thing. Greatest of all time. And that's an interesting aspiration. And I don't think men generally have been trained or ever invited to think that the way you're great is by serving the least. I'm not speaking on behalf of women, but I will say as a guy, that's not what I'm taught to think. We play King of the Hill. We played that seriously during recess. And you don't get there by staying at the bottom and checking on the people that just got knocked down the hill. You get there by being the knocker. So I went on and on. Sorry. Deborah, what?
I was just thinking that in terms of what they were talking about, I can't see them arguing among themselves which one is the greatest, considering what just happened. They've just been told that Jesus is going to die. They can't believe it. And then they all get upbraided in front of the crowd. And my reaction to that wouldn't be, oh, let me see who among all of us here, you just read us the riot act. Now, I can't see us all going, well, which one of us the greatest book going, what? I don't get it. I don't get any of this.
So it might be a genuine question.
Yeah.
I mean, well, if the inner circle isn't great, who is? if being the inner circle is not greatness, what is? Something like that. Yeah. So remembering what's happened, first you have Simon Peter, always willing to front himself. He gets slapped down pretty hard in the last story. But you get Peter, James, and John, who get to go up in the mountain and see Jesus in all of his glory. Peter speaks up there, and he gets slapped down pretty hard. Lord, this is great. Let us build 3 temples, one for you, one for Elijah. And the voice from the heavens says, shut up, Peter. Right? Maybe not in those terms. But again, silence. They come down the hill. The other 9 disciples are down there with a crowd because they had been trying to cast a demon out of somebody and couldn't do it. And Jesus does it. And now they're asking, well, why couldn't we do it? And they got every reason to be asking, all right, if I want to be a really, really good disciple, what am I doing wrong here? All my answers seem to be wrong. And I don't know how to follow the way one should follow. I don't give the disciples a ton of credit, but I think the question they're asking is not a silly one. Yes, ma'am.
I was hung up on the law of inversion, and I kept thinking about that. And if they had been better in their grammar, or They would have understood that the law of inversion is the verb first and not the subject. And if they kept thinking, what do I need to do? What am I doing? And he says, servant. And servant does things, you know, if they had focused on that, I think they would have not been arguing who is greatest. It's what am I doing?
Hmm.
And what needs to be done,
Right. Yeah.
verb before subject.
Yes, ma'am.
Were they concerned about who was going to be their leader if Jesus was going to be killed?
That could be a great, that's
Who's gonna
a
be-
great possibility. Look, he's gonna die. Who's next? John dies, Jesus goes public. John gets arrested, Mark's gospel. As soon as John gets arrested, Jesus starts preaching. John dies about the time Jesus sent the 12 out on a little missionary journey, and they did really, really well. It's one time in the gospel where they seem to really live in what they're called to. And now they're looking, if Jesus is gonna die, who could we possibly trust? Right? Who could possibly bring us? Yeah, succession. All right, it is 11:01. And so we're gonna end right here. Friends, no class next week. No class next week. So here's a little guide for you, okay? If you accidentally show up, then just accidentally go to Gelson, buy some treats, bring him into the office and say, oh, I came because you guys do such a great job. I wanted to give you some treats. And I know you're missing Mark so terribly this week. So here you go. Other than that, you know, or go home in shame and hope nobody's like. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.